From propaganda campaigns deflecting blame from various countries to 5G conspiracy theories and a traditional medicine said to cure COVID-19, we're discussing all of the various propaganda and conspiracy theories that have stemmed from coronavirus in the past few weeks. Keep watching to find out more. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Insight Weekly. If you enjoy our content, don't forget, like, share and comment, ask us some questions and you may just feature on next week's podcast. In this week's episode, the team are discussing various propaganda campaigns as well as conspiracy theories from across each region that we've seen as a result of COVID-19. First of all, we're heading to Matt, who's going to discuss what he's seen this week in Europe.
Cheers. Thanks very much, Laura. Okay, so I've been seeing quite a lot of propaganda threats emerging across Europe with regards to the COVID-19 pandemic, but there are probably two which would warrant which would warrant mention. The first one is the 5G conspiracy theorists. Now, during this pandemic, there's been a growing narrative supporting a conspiracy theory of COVID-19 being linked to the rollout of 5G. And a lot of supporters of this conspiracy theory have been carrying out a number of arson attacks on 5G masts. And we've seen this across the UK, Belgium, Netherlands, and Spain. In addition, there's been even some recent developments where these conspiracy theorists have been harassing and threatening telecommunications engineers. And there's also been a few cases where these conspiracy theorists have actually targeted other forms of telecommunications infrastructure. For example, in The Hague, these conspiracy theorists conducted an arson attack on a C2000 telecommunications mast. Now, that kind of capability actually provides communications for emergency services. In addition, these conspiracy theorists have actually been attending anti-lockdown rallies in order to spread their message. So, when looking at this kind of propaganda threat, at the moment, there's not just these guys don't actually just pose a threat to the rollout of 5G, but actually just telecommunications infrastructure in general, which, given the current crisis, is actually going to make things very difficult as it threatens communications of any kind, up to and including those used by emergency services and law enforcement. In addition, with their attendance at anti-lockdown rallies, these conspiracy theorists would appear to be creating a scenario of guilt by association, where those who are expressing some relevant concerns about the COVID-19 lockdowns, there's a possibility that these people will start to be just associated with conspiracy theorists and undermine any kind of concerns related to lockdowns. The second propaganda threat being seen across Europe mainly pertains to the Chinese government. Now, since the pandemic, the Chinese government has been adopting a bit of a twofold strategy with, first of all, providing a lot of medical supplies in terms of PPE and also wider medical equipment to European countries who are struggling to address the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, providing such large amounts of equipment is, of course, painting them in a positive light. And at the same time, what the Chinese government has been doing is actually responding harshly to any kind of criticism expressed towards it with relation to its complicity in the outbreak of this pandemic.
So what other actors and propaganda threats are you seeing across Europe, Matt?
Elsewhere, there's a wide variety, but we've also seen indications of far right, radical left, even Islamic extremism threats. For example, up in northern England, we came across an incident recently where those linked to far right groups were caught spreading essentially pamphlets of linking COVID-19 to anti-immigration sentiment. So, and there's even been cases of neo-Nazis emerging, and essentially a lot of, I suppose, long-standing threats. That essentially they've been a little bit hard to track, but they certainly haven't gone away.
And earlier, Matt, you mentioned Chinese authorities were cracking down on people who were sort of disagreeing with their narrative. How exactly have they gone about doing this?
At the moment, what they've been essentially doing is responding directly to a lot of journalists who have been writing pieces which are critical of the Chinese government, especially those who have been mentioning the Chinese government's complicity in the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. The messaging sort of focuses around a narrative of how dare you, we warn the world of this pandemic, how dare you criticize us. So at the moment, it's just been limited to the Chinese government responding that way. But with the amount of PPE that they've been supplying around the world, there's a possibility that the governments they're supplying this to may start to jump on board with responding to critics of the Chinese government this way.
So, yeah, that's interesting you say that, Matt, because China has been carrying out quite a sophisticated, I guess you could call it a propaganda campaign at home as well, in which they've tried to control the narrative regarding COVID-19. And they've done that. They've done this in Chinese media pretty effectively. Obviously, the Chinese government has almost complete control over Chinese media. But as you said, I've noticed them consistently targeting foreign journalists now as well, or at least trying to suppress what they're saying if it contradicts a Chinese narrative. But with that said, the Chinese narrative has been really interesting, I've found, throughout this period. Because at first, they obviously, as we know, they attempted to hide and cover up the initial outbreak. But pretty soon it became clear to them that this simply wasn't possible. The outbreak was at such a scale that they had to, that it was impossible to hide. And instead, they've actually released multiple different narratives here, but all pretty much blame the Americans. And I won't go into the American side of the argument. I'm just going to stick to the Chinese side. But I've seen quite a few different reports in Chinese media now. One actually claimed a U.S. Intelligence operative entered the country carrying the disease, and he was patient zero in China. So they've been constantly changing. At times, they've actually contradicted each other. For example, now they're claiming it didn't start in the wet food market, whereas earlier they did. And it might sound like these contradicting narratives are just making the Chinese overall one look weak. But in reality, they seem to be going for a slightly different strategy, one quite similar to what the Russians have used in places such as Ukraine and Syria. And that strategy is, rather than going for one narrative and sticking to it, they've thrown out multiple different narratives, which pretty much all blame the USA or some other Western states. And they've been throwing these out and letting them gain traction in social media as people have read these on Chinese media, and they've spread. And as a result, we've actually seen these Chinese narratives gain a fair bit of traction. So the reasons for doing this are quite simple, but at the same time quite complex. So there's the main reason, which all countries have tried to control the narratives regarding the disease, and that's that they simply don't want to be at the receiving end of maybe diplomatic pressure or political pressure related to the outbreak. So the USA, for example, have been quite consistently calling for reparations from China for their claiming that it's their fault because the disease started in their country. So China naturally is trying to deflect this, and they're aware that this could be quite damaging for them, not only financially or economically, but also from a reputation perspective. But secondly, there's also fears in China that this could have serious consequences with the relationship with the USA. Both countries, whilst at the moment of a strong period of cooling relations, both countries do still rely on each other quite heavily, and their economies are quite intricately entwined. So whilst they are in a bit of a war of words at the moment, to say the least, they are still there's a sense that both countries are really reluctant to let it escalate much further. And I think China do genuinely fear that could happen, and almost as a result of the war of narratives going on around COVID-19. So China is certainly releasing its own narratives. They've changed, they've developed, and they'll probably continue to develop as well. But at the moment, as Matt said, I think they're just trying to suppress anyone that speaks out against their narrative, while simultaneously trying to reinforce their own one.
Yes, I was going to ask, have any other propaganda narratives taken hold in other countries in your region?
From other countries have sort of began to start their own, but really they've formed off the back of the Chinese one. So it's an interesting question, and I think a good country to focus on here would be Iran. So Iran was another country that had a massive outbreak, and is another country where media is quite tightly controlled. So they have the ability to control the narrative a bit better than other countries. So the Iranian outbreak was believed to be quite catastrophic, actually, and even to this day, we're not 100% sure what the casualty figures were. A lot of people have said they're much higher than they were, and the Iranian government has, as expected, suggested that they're a bit lower than people think. But regardless, the Iranians have tried to control this narrative as well. And whilst they have created some of their own additions to it, for example, some of them claimed it was a biological weapon released by the USA, or it was released by US intelligence, or something along those lines. They generally have followed the same lines as the Chinese narratives, which is that the USA have introduced this disease into their country for political reasons. And in Iran, has actually gone as far as they've turned down aid from the Americans, claiming that it would be poison chalice, almost claiming that it's more weaponized disease. And they essentially felt that if they accepted the aid, then their narrative suggested that if they accepted the aid, then they'd be accepting a weapon from the USA. But again, there's always more to it than at first meets the eye. And it's worth remembering here, the Iranian government's under a lot of pressure domestically right now. So there's still economic protests taking place across the country. And whilst a lot of the time these aren't openly anti-government, they are criticizing the government for their relatively poor economic handling of the country. So the Iranian government's really keen to try and deflect blame for this COVID-19 outbreak, because even from Iranian citizens themselves and from citizens of the broader region, they've come under a lot of threats, a lot of stress, and a lot of criticism. So it's very much within the Iranian government's interest to try and deflect this blame. And to them, the Americans are a very easy scapegoat, and a very typical one as well. The Iranians have frequently released statements blaming the US for other economic woes taking place in Iran. So yes, to directly answer your question, Vincent, these narratives have really taken hold in other countries.
That's interesting, Max. And I kind of wanted to piggyback off the China-US rhetoric that you were talking about. In the case of the US, what we've seen was early on, we saw the administration give positive statements regarding China's response. However, that rhetoric has changed in the last month, with Trump saying that China should face the consequences if it knowingly played a part in the start of the pandemic. And around the same time, we also saw Trump endorse a theory that the virus started in a lab in Wuhan. This rhetoric has also been compounded by the US saying that China lied about the original case numbers, which was in a way supported when China altered its death toll after the pandemic. And then lately, we've also seen an intelligence report being released by US intelligence agencies saying that the virus of a delay from China was in order to hoard medical supplies. This rhetoric against China will likely increase in the coming months as the US is about to see a general election in November, and also as a means for the administration and Trump to deflect from the criticism domestically about the administration's response to the pandemic. What I'd also like to focus on is the rhetoric coming from anti-lockdown protests within the US. So while these protests initially started more geared towards economic woes, the rhetoric has changed, and now it's more, what we're seeing is more people complaining about how lockdowns are unconstitutional, they're an infringement on citizens' rights. But we've also seen banners and speech coming from these protests regarding, as we've seen in Europe, anti-5G, anti-vaccines, as well as religious fundamentalism. Also, these protests have also targeted certain actors like Dr. Fauci or Bill Gates. And these are based on conspiracy theories that are spread online and in certain groups, anti-lockdown groups, regarding that Bill Gates is pushing for a vaccine as a means to depopulate the world, as a means to implant digital records in people to see who's been vaccinated and who hasn't. The rhetoric from the anti-vaccine crowd has also led to propaganda and conspiracy theories that IV injected vitamin C is a cure, and that even people who've received the flu vaccination before COVID-19 are now more susceptible to getting COVID-19.
What do you think could be some of the consequences of this rhetoric?
Well, the rhetoric is quite divisive, and the U.S., as we know right now, is already quite divided along the lines of Democrats and Republicans. But what we can see is potential violence. So at the end of March, we saw a train engineer attempt to derail a train at the port of Los Angeles to crash into the USNS Mercy ship. Because, according to him, he believed that a ship was there for nefarious purposes other than treating COVID-19 patients. We've also seen just last week the arrest of a man in Colorado, in Loveland, Colorado, who had pipe bombs at his home. And he had initially come onto the FBI and ATF's radar because of a social media post reflecting anger and asking people to bring assault rifles to an anti-lockdown protest at the state capitol in Denver. So there is potential in regards to this, regarding violence. What we may also see is if conspiracy theories like the 5G being related to the COVID-19 outbreak, we might see what we've seen in Europe in regards to attacks on telecom infrastructure. So there's the potential for an uptick in violence, especially if quarantine measures, lockdown measures are extended in certain areas of the country.
Yeah, so with Africa, over the past couple of weeks, the president of Madagascar has been touting this organic cure for COVID-19, which at the moment comes in the form of a drink. It is expected to be administered in other forms, such as intravenously, in the coming weeks. It has only been tested on 30 people, but several countries have expressed interest in the drug, and shipments have been sent to countries such as Guinea-Bissau and Equatorial Guinea. It hasn't been scientifically proven, but scientific research is to be carried out in the coming weeks. The key problem here is that it is being marketed as a cure, and as a result, we could see, a rise in coronavirus cases in countries where it is used. But with the testing capacity still very low in Africa, I think this would be very difficult to measure. There have been similar developments in Guinea, where at the beginning of the outbreak, there were traditional healers in Kankan, which they claimed that they had developed a cure for the virus, and this week they claim to have treated some COVID-19 patients. Since the outbreak, there have been a number of myths and about the coronavirus. The most prominent were that Black Africans were immune to the virus and that the virus could not survive in Africa due to the warm climate. There have been other theories that have also caught traction in each country, but again, it's difficult to measure the sort of impact that this is having. Until surveys are carried out, we won't know. Arrests against the dissemination of fake news or misinformation have been made in some of these countries, including Morocco, Tanzania, South Africa, and Kenya. In countries such as Morocco and Tanzania, where there are already concerns with the crackdown on free speech, and when arrests are made because of threats to public disorder, I think this is a real gray area that could lead to a rise in popular anger, which could then manifest itself in the form of protests and contribute to anti-government sentiment as well.
It's quite interesting, the feature of misinformation. Viraj, what have you noticed in terms of protests arising from misinformation or fake news?
Yeah, so we have seen protests, early on in Morocco, where some protesters in Fez called, COVID-19 a divine test. And there is evidence that fake news can lead to a breakdown in security, especially in poorly policed areas, such as Lagos in mid-April. And there was also unrest in Abidjan, where protesters dismantled COVID-19 isolation centers because they accused authorities of deliberately trying to infect them. There were also protests in Yamoussoukro, where after local residents rejected the isolation of employees of a mining company at a hotel because they thought that similar to Abidjan, that this could bring the virus to their neighborhood. So there are implications for businesses here as well.
Thank you very much, team. And we've actually rolled out a new way that our clients can very quickly identify the instance that we've discussed in this week's episode of Insight Weekly. If you navigate to the advanced filters on the platform, select tags and search for hashtag Insight Weekly, that will bring up all of the incidents we've discussed this week that support our analysis. And for everyone else, of course, we still have our free COVID-19 resources available. That includes a free live map of the last 250 coronavirus-related incidents across the globe. I'll pop a link in the YouTube description so that you can access that at any time. And don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe to our YouTube channel to make sure you're the first one to watch next week's episode. Until then, stay safe.